This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening. Welcome to this episode of the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guest today is Professor Carlo Lancellotti, and we're going to talk about the late philosopher Augusto Del Noce and the Crisis of Modernity. If you're not familiar with Del Noce, you're going to definitely want to listen. I think you're going to find this interview very enlightening. And even though Del Noce died in 1989, I would argue it's really relevant for today and helps us understand a lot of our contemporary situation. So before I get to the interview, just a couple of quick things. I want to tell you again about the Acton Institute's upcoming Poverty Cure Summit on November 18th and 19th. It's online, virtual. There's a lot of interesting speakers and topics on both domestic and global poverty. So go to povertycuresummit.org or acton.org or povertycure.org to find out more. Second, thanks to all of you who have written reviews or given a rating and shared the podcast with your family and friends. I really appreciate it. I've got some nice comments from people, so I'm glad you're finding it worthwhile. If you have any suggestions or comments, you can contact me at michaelmathesonmiller.com. And again, if you like the podcast and you haven't done a reading, please do that. It's really helpful. So on to the interview. My guest today is Professor Carlo Lancellotti. He's a professor of mathematical physics at the College of Staten Island at the City University of New York. And he also teaches physics at the Graduate School of the City University of New York. His research includes work on kinetic theory of plasmas and gravitating systems. He did his undergraduate at the University of Milan and his PhD at the University of Virginia. Well, in addition to his work in physics, he is the translator of the Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce, and that's going to be the topic of today's podcast. Now, Del Noce was born in 1910 and died in 1989, so he really lived through the turmoil of the 20th century. In his critical analysis of it, he wrote a lot of essays. He was a profound social analyst. He wrote about secularization, atheism, revolution, totalitarianism, the sexual revolution, and a critical engagement with Karl Marx. Now, in 1989, before he died, he actually argued that Marxist ideas failed in the East, but realized themselves in the West. So it failed economically and politically, but was realized philosophically. And part of this was a shift, he argues, from a commercial society, a kind of a Christian bourgeois, to pure bourgeois. And we're going to talk about that, where this search for liberation and happiness is done purely in the material realm. And so this is really an anthropological shift. So in this wide-ranging conversation, I talked to Professor Lancellotti about totalitarianism, about the religious nature of revolution. We talk about Eric Voegelin, consumerism, the hybrid of Marxist anthropology with this bourgeois pursuit of happiness. We talk about hippies and yuppies, the absolutization of politics, and the danger of forbidding questions, and why questions and the search for the actual activity of philosophy is so very important. So I think you're going to like it. I think you're going to find it very helpful for not only understanding the historical development of where we are, but really, I think Lancellotti and the work of Augusto Del Noce really sheds light on our contemporary situation. So thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoy the interview with Carlo Lancellotti. Carlo, thank you for joining the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, Carlo, I'd like to talk to you today about a couple of things, mostly the work of Augusto Del Noce, and maybe some of the essays that you've written in Communio, and I'll put links to those up on the podcast show notes. But let's talk a little bit about Augusto Del Noce. Who is he, and why is he important? And tell us a little bit about the translation projects that you're doing.
Well, I mean, Del Noce is a well-known name back in Italy. Del Noce was from Italy, like me, and he's probably the best-known Catholic political philosopher in the Italian 20th century. He's also very well known in France by now, but he was never translated into English. And he was suffering of what I call the chicken egg question, that, he was unknown, so nobody cared to translate him, and vice versa. Since he was not translated, nobody knew him. Part of the problem was that Del Noce was not a Marxist. During his lifetime, Italian culture was hegemonized by Marxism. And so the gatekeeper of scholarly translations certainly would not be interested in Del Noce. Del Noce was a professor of philosophy, but what I think is interesting about him is that he was a philosopher very engaged with history and culture. So all of his philosophy, all of his work is not systematic or theoretical, but it's about understanding contemporary history. That was really his big thing. And he was a big specialist of Marxism and secularization. And both topics are still relevant. He died in 1989. And I think it was kind of scandalous that he was never translated. And since I live in the States and I see that some of the phenomena that happened in Europe 50 years ago are somehow still relevant to what's going on today, I felt that somebody should translate Del Noce. So I just took matters in my own hands and translated 2 volumes so far. I have a 3rd volume in the making.
So the first one you did was The Crisis of Modernity, is that right?
Yeah, back in 2015. And then there is a 2nd volume called The Age of Secularization. They're both essay collections. I mean, that was really Del Noce's format because he was so engaged with events and with contemporary problems. He was mostly an essayist as a format. He wrote essays. The first volume, The Crisis of Modernity, is my own selection of what I thought would be most interesting to an English-speaking audience, while the 2nd volume, The Age of Secularization, is a collection that he himself assembled back in 1970. So because he selected then some essays are a little more idiosyncratic for a contemporary readership. And I'm translating his most famous book. His most famous book is called The Problem of Atheism and goes back to 1963. And it's a very rich work, but it's also hard to read. So even if it is the one that is still most famous back in Italy, I felt I should wait on it because it is more for scholars in some sense.
So let's go through some of his key ideas. Maybe we can focus perhaps on secularization. I think you said something that's important, and this is something I've talked about before, which is I think in the United States, there's been a tendency to identify Marxism with its economic elements. So the abolition of private property, kind of communist politics. But Marxism, of course, extends much bigger than that. It's an anthropological worldview. It's a view of the human person. It's a view of culture, a view of society. And in, I think it was 89, is that right? Del Noce argued that there was the victory of Marxism. So here at the end of the fall of the Soviet Union is about to fall, the Berlin Wall is collapsing, or it's just collapsed, and Del Noce, people like Solzhenitsyn also, Cardinal Ratzinger too, said that Marxism is really the radical execution of the spirit of our age. And Del Noce says, Marxism is victorious. You said, I think Marxism's relevant, but for a lot of people, they wouldn't think that. They wouldn't think Marxism's relevant. Why do you think, and why does Del Noce think Marxism is so relevant today in 2020? I mean, you would say that. And then why in 89, before he died, did he think Marxism was victorious?
Yes, let me make a general comment. Del Noce thought that ideas matter, to cite a famous book by an American author. And
right. Weaver, yeah. Ideas have consequences.
Ideas have consequences, yes. And he really felt that one manifestation of Marxism in our culture is the tendency to explain developments in terms of economics, in terms of sociology, in terms of material factors. This is what he calls sociologism, right? So that to some extent, we kind of really still believe in the Marxist idea that culture is a superstructure. I don't know if you remember that right. Marxism has this idea of the structure and the superstructure, and that somehow the stories we tell about ourselves, religion, philosophies, metaphysics, the narrative we have is a superstructure that really is just a reflection of this underlying structure, which is the means of production, the way we work, the way we relate socially. Okay, that's a Marxist idea, but Del Noce criticizes it at the root. He thinks that there is what he calls ideal causality, the effect of ideas, that ideas have effects on social life and that human beings require a story, require a meaning. And so the way we choose to live reflects the story, the philosophy, the thought we have about ourselves. So it's impossible to understand history without a philosophical, not purely sociological element, right? So this is why for him, Marx is interesting, because Marx has an idea of man, a new and different idea of man, which is radically incompatible with the traditional, what he calls Platonic and Christian, because he thinks it's in common between the Greeks and then European Christianity idea of man. And there are many ways to describe this difference, but to him, what characterized the traditional Greek and then Christian anthropology was this idea that men participate in the logos, that to be human is to participate, if you wish, in the mind of God. You could also say to be made in the image of God, but where this image of God is marked by irrationality. So the way we can communicate is because we all share in a common universal rationality, which is not just a product of social circumstances, that there is such a thing as perennial truth, permanent values that human reason can intuit, can perceive. By contrast, Marxism radically denies this idea of participation in the logos. Marxism views man as the product of the means of production. The human being is a social animal. It's not a rational animal, it's a social animal. It's completely the reflection of material, historical circumstances. And to Del Noce, this change in the idea of man as deep consequences. And so he thinks that contemporary history, the history of the 20th century, cannot be understood except as the unfolding of this new idea of man born in the 19th century that kind of came to fruition first in Europe and then to some extent later on in the States, of this different anthropology. And so to him, when he was faced with the new affluent society after World War II, the rich, affluent, consumerist society, if he had to judge what idea of man it reflected, it basically accepted this Marxist vision of humanity. It did not criticize it. It accepted that, for instance, it's ethically relativistic. But where does the ethical relativism comes from? From the fact that there are no permanent ethical values. Ethical values are a product of our social interactions. Society changes, values will change. This was a very common refrain back in the 60s during the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution itself, in his view, is a hybrid combination of Marxism and Freudism, right? Because he likes to cite the Austrian psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich to the fact that we are sexually repressed. And if we are going to be liberated from repression, we'll be happy. And this is very common, very similar to the Marxist idea of the false consciousness, right? That we create religion because we are oppressed. When we are free from oppression, religion will evaporate. If you translate this in terms of sexuality, we create religious ideas, ethical ideas, because we are sexually repressed. If you eliminate sexual repression, then people will stop being religious by default, because religion is this false consciousness. Okay, so you see that these ideas, these Marxist ideas, in his opinion, were very present in a different way, philosophically, still in anti-Marxist, theoretically anti-Marxist politics, like the West in the 60s and 70s. So much so that when the Soviet Union ended, he made this kind of statement that yes, that it ended as communism because as a philosophy, as a view of what makes people happy, it was kind of dominant everywhere else.
Right. I think it was you, and I'm not sure if you're quoting Del Noce, but made this point that in many ways the reaction of the anti-communist West was one of this idea that we could compete on secularity, so in well-being and prosperity. So, for example, how do we show the Soviet Union that we are superior? Well, we have more prosperity, more well-being, more liberation, including sexual liberation, and so in a sense, the West, at least, I this probably doesn't describe all of the West. I mean, you have obviously John Paul II is resisting communism as well, but that in the West, and maybe specifically in the United States, this idea that we can beat you on all these fundamentally materialist terms. So at the end, we, in a sense, appropriated Marxist philosophical positions and anthropological positions, and so capitalism, as it were, became, for the lack of a better word, Marxicized. So you had the capitalist economics, but then you get this consumerism and this liberation that is fundamentally Marxist. And so in that sense, Marxism realizes itself, according to Del Noce, if I'm understanding him correctly, in the West, even though it fails in the East. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. And it is an argument he makes in one essay called Death of the Sacred in the Crisis of Modernity. And his diagnosis that this started happening in the late 50s. Because in his observation, at least in Europe, the years immediately after the World War II, the fight against communism was still phrased in terms of, say, a Christian civilization against an atheistic civilization, right? But then what he sees is that in the newspapers, in magazines, in the literature, in just even in scholarship, between 1955 and 1960, there was a shift in which people started talking about the idea of a Christian civilization and started talking about this idea that the West would be free, but would be free in a sense of favoring the pursuit of happiness in a bourgeois sense, so to speak. The idea that the West would be, as you said, more where people would be richer, happier, sexually liberated, have more refrigerators, microwave ovens, and more cars, subdivisions. That in a sense, that's what would beat communism at its own game. And in his opinion, this idea became dominant in Western culture around from 1960 on. I mean, he quotes Kennedy. He had the impression that Kennedy, the young Turks, that generation, the technocratic generation of the early 60s, kind of embraced this approach towards the Soviet Union.
So, maybe one of the things that he talks about, and you mentioned several times, is this idea of it moved from a Christian bourgeois to a pure bourgeois. And this idea of, and there's a couple things going on there. Could you talk a little bit, could you explain, what does Del Noce mean by this move from a Christian bourgeois? First, I maybe say, what do you mean by bourgeois? And then what do you mean from a move from a Christian bourgeois to a pure bourgeois that, in a sense, appropriates Marxist anthropology?
Well, on this idea of the bourgeois, Del Noce refers to a French Protestant sociologist, Jacques Ellul, who wrote several books. Many of them have been translated into English, but the one on the bourgeois has not been translated, so it's completely unknown.
What's the name of that? So I know his work on propaganda and on the Technological Society.
Well, in French,
and Christian.
In English, if it was translated, it would be called The Metamorphosis of the Bourgeois. La Métamorphose du Bourgeois. Anyway, in this book, Ellul argues that the bourgeois is characterized by the idea of strictly worldly happiness, that it is possible to be happy in the world, and that everything can be used for the pursuit of happiness. So in order to understand the significance of this formulation, you have to kind of contrast it with, say, for instance, St. Augustine, right? Or the Christian tradition. There is the sense that ultimately human fulfillment is, to some extent, otherworldly, right? There is the idea of beatitude, okay? The idea that the human heart is restless, as St. Augustine says, and it will not rest until it finds its rest in you, talking to God, right? So in the Confessions of St. Augustine, there is the idea of this infinity of the human desire, because the human being is made for God. And so, to some extent, life in the world is a pilgrimage. It cannot be fulfilled happiness. It's a walk towards happiness, but ultimately happiness belongs in heaven, belongs in beatitude. By contrast, the modern idea of happiness as it started to develop in the 18th century, according to Ellul, Del Noce, is this idea that it is possible to be happy in this world, that we don't need, there is no restless heart, in a sense, that in a sense, if we have enough material possessions, if we have a sexual life, if we have a good family, if we have good circumstances, there is a natural end to human life, which is self-sufficient, which is does not require any reference to God. So if you want, it's kind of a secular idea of happiness. And the consequence of this is then that everything becomes an instrument for this, right? Not everything can be used. Everything can be bought and sold and used to achieve this kind of idea of happiness. And in a sense, you could argue, but it's not my field, that the Enlightenment idea of the pursuit of happiness, even as expressed in the American Constitution, has a bit of this flavor, if you wish, this flavor of an optimistic pursuit of happiness unrelated to the transcendent, so to speak. So if this is the difference between beatitude and happiness, ultimately this is in a tension with Christianity, because in Christianity there is two things that Del Noce says kind of grate against this idea of worldly happiness. One is that there is original sin, right? From the Christian perspective, life in the world is marred by a wound, by an imperfection, by this idea of a original fall that makes worldly happiness to some extent impossible. And then there is also this idea of the divine image in people, that people are made in the image of God, so they cannot be used, right? So the bourgeois kind of rebels against the idea that some things cannot be used, cannot be traded, cannot be made the object of trade. So because of this contradiction, in a sense, the 19th century bourgeois world in Europe and in America was a little bit suffering, because its morality was still, to many extent, Christian. It was still a Christian morality, which may be secularized in the Kantian form. The idea of the Kantian imperative is a secularized form of ethics morality, because it says that everything, human beings can never be a mean, can only be an end, right? So this idea that human beings can never be a mean means that human beings ultimately cannot be used for the pursuit of happiness. So in the Noce's
which is interesting. Sorry, so just to stop there for just a second, so that you're two things. You're saying, if I understand you, that you have the beginning of this bourgeois kind of pursuit of happiness that you see, for example, in the Declaration. You also see in the context like that man has inalienable rights given to him by God. So there's this idea of God. There's also kind of a Christian civilization, yes. And there's a little bit of a remnant of kind of Christianity / Kantianism, where man cannot be a means to an end, but always must be seen end in himself, which I think is interesting. I mean, Wojtyła, as you know, calls that the personalist norm. Mm-hmm. So in this Kantian way, that remains, if I'm understanding you, but the foundations are slowly being weakened. And at one point, I'm not sure if I think it's you, Carlo, make this point that that the liberal order has a weak anthropology. Mm-hmm. And once the positive, strong anthropology of Marx comes in, Lockean anthropology is defenseless against it. So in one sense, it was Lockean anthropology, I think, is deeply problematic. But it was like soft, man's in a state of nature, he's contracts, a lot of kind of presupposed Christianity going on. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of invisible things he's taking for granted. He's hollow. I mean, I think part of I describe the Enlightenment as it hollows out the lived experience of, say, Christian civilization over the years, but it doesn't remain because now it's, in your language, defenseless against any type of positive atheist vision of the person that's all materialist like Marx.
Right.
Is that what you're saying? And then that plays out in the affluent society where now everything becomes an object of consumption or trade.
Yes, that's exactly correct. I mean, the big claim, or if you want, attempt of the 19th century as a whole, with painting with a very broad brush, was this idea that you could preserve Christian morality without a theology, or you could preserve Christian values without Christianity, religion within the limit of reasons. That in a sense, there is a very interesting passage in Kant I saw once, in which Kant says that, okay, Christianity revealed to us the correct ethics. Now that we know it, we don't need Christianity anymore, right? It is objective. It is something that everybody it's autonomous, Kant calls it autonomous morality. People may have not noticed, but when you see it, it stands by itself, right? So there was this idea that Christian morality stands by itself, even after we lost our faith, in some sense. And the Noce says
so it's the naivete there. You're naive, without faith we can continue.
It was kind of easy to do for people like Kant, whose mom was a very devout pietist that brought him to church every Sunday for all his life as a Lutheran. But I mean, the point is that, as you said, the 20th century kind of disproved this. The 20th century slowly brought to light that there was a close connection between Christian morality and the Christian idea of a human being, the Christian idea of the Christian anthropology. And so that when you bring in a new anthropology, ultimately also the ethics has to adapt, has to conform. I mean, I should mention perhaps that Del Noce started his reflection on Marx because Catholics, Del Noce was Catholic, and Catholics in 1945 in Italy had the big question of how to fight fascism and how to deal with communism. And many Catholics came to the conclusion that an alliance against fascism with communists was not just justified as a practical, pragmatic, tactical maneuver, but could be given a general, enduring philosophical foundation, precisely in the idea that we can share in the same ethics, that ultimately Marx was some kind of ethically Christian atheist. Okay, the idea that in Marx, some kind of atheism was just this kind of tacked on reaction against clericalism or against the mistakes of Christians. But the deep down, the Marxist drive to liberation against capitalism was perfectly compatible with the Christian ethics. And Del Noce was tempted by this idea himself as a young man, and it was a complicated story. But after a while, by studying Marx, he realized that Marx is not just atheism attached, just opposed to a fundamentally Christian ethics, but Marx all starts from this new anthropology, that all the kind of internal workings of the Marxist worldview reflect this idea of the social man, this idea, that we do not depend on God and we create ourselves through work, we create ourselves through our labor socially. Okay, and there is this deep rejection of the Christian idea of man as a relationship with God, that ultimately, really, the idea that Marxism and Christian ethics are compatible is deeply mistaken. And so, sorry, let me finish. I didn't answer your question. Sorry, just to finish answering your question. So,
sure, please.
The result was that as this Marxist view became dominant in Europe, this aspect of materialism, this aspect of sociologism, turned out to be very convenient to the bourgeois mindset, because it kind of made man independent of God and freer to pursue happiness individualistically, right? Because another way to look at this is that in a traditional classical vision, human happiness is relational, that we are happy by relating to God and to other people. Instead, from a Marxist perspective, we all achieve liberation together, but my liberation is not predicated on being in relation with you. So essentially, it's an independence. It's an idea of independence. It's the idea. Marx says that in the manuscripts of 1844, that man to be free must be independent. And now you see that this is much more suitable for a bourgeois individualistic idea of happiness than the Christian worldview. It's much more consonant to an individualistic bourgeois view, because there's this idea of being independently pursuing happiness. What prevented Marxism as such to be acceptable to a bourgeois worldview is that in Marxism there was also the idea of the revolution. And the Noce think that there is a contradiction here. That in Marxism there are two contradictory aspects. There is this relativistic, materialistic aspect of radical independence and self-creation. And there is also this kind of semi-religious faith that the world is marching towards the revolution, towards this big change that will bring about happiness. And then Noce thinks that these two aspects kind of split, right? And that when people stopped believing in the revolution, when the revolution never came about, what was left was just the materialistic, relativistic aspect. And this was very favorable to a bourgeois worldview. And so it kind of, Marxists did the yeoman work, how do you call it, did the job of destroying the traditional Christian anthropology and making it possible for the bourgeois spirit to free itself from Kant, for example.
I think there's a number of ways we could go from that. I mean, one thing that strikes me is I gave a lecture once where I was going through this idea that what we see is a muscular atheism in the 20th century of we're going to build heaven on earth. It fails to deliver in a sense. And so it goes from a Tower of Babel idea to more of a Sodom and Gomorrah idea of we're still going to shake our fist at God. We're not going to be in a relationship with God, but it's really for pleasure. And Ratzinger has this line, which I have to paraphrase, but he said that when the Soviet Union fell, relativism did not die, but it combined with gratification to form a potent mix. Mm-hmm. And I think this is an interesting parallel to Del Noce, because it seems that what you're saying is that there's a hybrid, this gratification, this desire for pleasure combines with a bourgeois capitalist worldview. And of course, capitalism is much more complex than that. But let's just talk about make it simple. It serves it, and so it makes it easy to kind of develop and go on. I think that's one interesting point. The other is maybe let's just talk about a little bit about this idea of atheism. I'd like to go back to this concept of revolution in a minute, but let's maybe develop a little bit more about Marx's anthropology, because you make this claim in one of your essays where you say there's a postulatory atheism to Marx. You said God cannot exist because if he exists, man cannot be free. And so Harry Ballin makes this point, which I think is kind of interesting. He says, if you look at modernity, the relationship for Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, it starts with, say, man alone or man in relationship with one another. But it neglects the early relationship of Adam with God. Mm-hmm. There's no other relationship of Adam with God. And that's that fundamental error, one could argue, and you press back if you think it's wrong, is what Del Noce sees. Marx takes this to its logical conclusion, yes, and then posits a positive atheism that, and this is following Feuerbach, I think, very clear, God's existence is a restraint on man's emancipation and his liberation. He must not exist.
Yes.
That seems to be this point. So could you maybe articulate a little bit of that positive atheism, and then we can go back to the affluent society and the idea of revolution?
Yes, there is a double opposition. First of all, there is an opposition between what we could call scientistic atheism and postulatory atheism in Del Noce's language. Just think of the 18th century. In the 18th century, there were atheists like, Baron d'Holbach, Lamettrie, those French philosophers. But to them, the denial of God was kind of the result of some kind of knowledge. Okay, so for instance, we discover Islam, Chinese religion, like these authors of the Enlightenment, we discovered a broader world. So it's not possible that our Christian religion is true because we discover many other religions. Or, for example, there is science, and science explains, later on with Darwinism, explains creation. So we don't need a creator anymore. So this is what he calls scientistic atheism. So it's an atheism that is not based on a moral demand, on a moral requirement, but it's atheism that is just based on some kind of new knowledge. The first manifestation was, the French libertines in the 1600s. These were these French intellectuals who kind of, again, discovered that the world was not the center of the universe after Galileo. So now, because the traditional cosmology has fallen apart, there cannot be God, because God cannot be in the external sphere, in the empyrean, or whatever. You know what I mean? These are all misguided notions, but they are at least, it's atheism based on some kind of knowledge of history, knowledge of nature.
It's somehow understandable. Right. I mean, right? You're like, oh, well, wait a minute.
It's about knowledge.
If all this, right. It's like you can. It may. When I say understandable, it may. The reasons for atheism are deeply complex, often moral questions. But at least it's a knowledge question.
Exactly.
But this postulatory one is a different thing, is what you're saying.
It's a postulate. We have to postulate that God does not exist, because if God existed, we are dependent. I mean, again, it's a beautiful passage in the manuscripts of 1844 by Marx, in which he says that if somebody depends on another person, is not free. I'm paraphrasing. the least free is if the other person creates you, because if the other person creates you, you are completely dependent. Okay, so Marx reads this in a completely negative sense. It is creation as a slavery, in some sense. And in one of these passages, Del Noce discusses how this kind of is very Protestant. I mean, Del Noce traces this back to Luther in some sense. This idea that there is a kind of an opposition of God and man, and that God, by creating, is like a master. God is like the prototype of the master. And so freedom requires that there is no master, so freedom requires that there is no creation. I mean, and so you see, then atheism is a postulate, something you have to postulate if you want to hope for liberation. The second opposition is between negative atheism and positive atheism, because in those form of 18th century atheism, ultimately people had to conclude that the human condition is desperate, right? So the denial of God had a negative connotation. It means that life makes no sense, right? It's the denial of sense. If there is no God, there is no meaning, right? There is no morality. So it's a bad thing. So even if we don't believe into God, for a negative atheist, belief would at least be desirable. So much so that in Del Noce's opinion, a consistent negative atheist ultimately is led to a religious attitude by the experience of human misery, right? So there is something missing. There is something we need, we don't have, and that raises the question of God. Okay, so negative atheism, in some sense, circles back to a religious position, whether it comes back to faith or not. By contrast, Marx is a positive atheist because he thinks that we can give meaning to our life, to use modern language. He doesn't use that language, but the way Marx would put it is that we can bring about the revolution. We can create a happy world. The reason for our misery is not original sin. The reason for our misery is that society is not well organized, which is an idea that goes back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France, right? And so to the extent that history is marching towards redemption through the revolution, being an atheist is being following the march to happiness, the march to freedom, right? You think of all the communist rhetoric, right? It is positive. Atheism is liberating. Atheism is going to liberate us from superstition, but it's going to redirect it towards the true happiness that we mistakenly placed in God, which is actually going to be placed in the classless society or in the sexually liberated society. Because again, to Del Noce, the sexual revolution is like an echo, kind of a strange repetition of this Marxist idea of liberation.
So, and this, of course, then leads us right already into the idea of revolution. And this is where you see some overlap here between Del Noce and the work of Eric Voegelin,
Yes.
where there's a certain a Gnostic idea that for Voegelin, one of the driving forces of modern politics, as you know, I know you read Voegelin because there's essays in Del Noce and Voegelin, but Voegelin makes this argument, right, that one of the driving forces of modern politics is a Gnostic idea, and that part of that is it's a post-Christian secularism. And like one of the things I think it's important also to make is that there's a difference between pre-Christian kind of Tower of Babel secularism, where we're going to create heaven on earth, and post-Christian, because post-Christian takes all of these ideas from Christianity and then secularizes them. And that what Voegelin calls in this wonderful phrase, the immanentization of the eschaton, yes. That the final times are not realized when Jesus comes and establishes the new kingdom of heaven and earth. But no, that's a false delusion. That's a belief that keeps you oppressed. That's the whole opiate of the people. And that instead, what we need to do is we need to realize the kingdom of heaven here on earth through technical and political means. But I think technical is as important as political. It's a political / technical solution to the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death. And so this revolution begins to have this religious nature to it. And I think, Ratzinger's very, very good on this. And maybe you could explain, what is Del Noce's position? It seems like he also thinks that in order to understand Marxism, we have to understand its religious nature, yes. And the revolution.
Right. You put it perfectly well already. Del Noce thinks that that Marxism has a religious aspect in the sense that it expects perfect worldly happiness and redemption, except that this redemption is going to be brought about by the internal dialectics of history. History as a direction, right? You hear this today again, sometimes in certain groups, right? That we are going with the direction of history. The direction of history is marching towards freedom, liberation, equality, except that Marx, by and large, does not describe what the classless society will be, because it is going to be so different, so new, so perfect that it has nothing in common with the current society. So here you see the Gnostic aspect. The Gnostic aspect is that the communist society is other, it's a different eon, in E-O-N. In Gnostic language, there is this idea that this world is under the domination of a bad God, and that somewhere else there is a good God, right? And that we have to escape from the flesh, we have to escape from the bad world under the bad God in this completely different other world. So you see that the difference that in Marxism, what was a cosmic jump in ancient Gnosticism becomes a historical jump. There is this miraculous, mysterious event called the Revolution, which will usher in a new world, a completely new world, so new that we cannot even describe it, because Marx does not describe it by and large. So because it's so new, so different, we can only believe in it, right? So much so that in some of his works, Del Noce describes it as a sort of Pascal's wager, right? Like we have to wager that there is going to be this new world. And this is what kind of has to drive Marxist political action. So again, Del Noce agrees with Vogelin. He makes a qualification to Vogelin in the sense that modern Gnosticism is historical, not cosmic, right? Because ancient Gnostic, as I said, was about going from one cosmos to a different cosmos, while in the modern view, it's just going from one age of history to a completely different age of history, which we simply cannot even envision.
So I think that's that tension between the revolution and the religious element, and then this kind of positive materialist view of man. Let's talk for a minute about the role of reason here, because one of the things that Del Noce seems to focus on is that in the understanding, a lot of these are all part of this is connected to this understanding of reason. And again, here you see overlap with Ratzinger, right? So like the Regensburg Address, earlier essays before he was Pope, saying that one of the problems with modern rationality is that it's reductionist and incoherent, and that we've reduced reason to the empirical. And when reason gets reduced to the empirical, and this is something Del Noce focuses on, it becomes instrumentalized. So reason is only instrumental, and that man, as you write and Del Noce writes, is now following Shaler, who I actually like a lot. I think Shaler's really worth listening to reading. Man is now homo faber. He's just a maker. He's just a thing. And that what happens is that in one sense, there's I think maybe a second tension, maybe you can comment on. So there's a tension between the revolution and the materialism, the spiritual, religious nature, and then this kind of very materialist nature. But also in the understanding of man is going to be liberated. Right, he's completely free, but at the same time, he's also reified. He's turned into a thing that has instrumental use. And so, what I like to quote C.S. Lewis on this, where he says, "Man's power over nature is always some men's power over other men." So that as man becomes turned into a thing, an instrumental thing, he can then be used for grand schemes of the totalitarian dictator or whatever it might be, or the eugenicist, or the scientist, or whatever. So could you talk a little bit about the role of reason, and then this reificate, this turning the person into an instrumental thing for use in Del Noce?
Yes. Well, I mean, first of all, as I said before, Del Noce feels that the core of Marxist philosophy is this idea of the social man, meaning that reason is purely a tool for production. Ideas are productive tools. They are a reflection of the truth, right? Because the idea of the truth, in a sense, implies this logos, implies that we participate in a common reason, so that 2 + 2 = 4 is true for everybody, and we can recognize it as something that in a sense is in the mind of God, something that has a transcendent perennial reality. Again, to Marx, this kind of things is enslaving, right? Because we must create ourselves. I mean, you can see this very clearly in some contemporary expressions like critical theory, when people complain about essentialism, right? That there is no human essence, no human nature. Especially in some of today's debates on sexuality, if you try to claim that there is a human nature that deserves to be respected, including sexual nature, you are going to be accused of being an essentialist, right? That there is...
it's interesting. It's almost like an inverse Thomism.
Right.
I've talked about this before. Like, what happens is that the existentialism of radical liberation is not enough, right? So that's not enough to ground freedom or to ground dignity. So it's like inverted. You start with raw freedom, and then you make a decision, and wherever you land in your, say, sexual predilection, then it's the plastic hardens. Now you have essence, and now that becomes identified with who you are. So it's interesting because it's both a rejection of essentialism, but also a new type of plastic essentialism that comes from radical liberation. So I think it's it's kind of an interesting turn where it's both rejects any sense of nature, but at the same time needs some kind of essence in order for you to ground dignity. Because you can't, if it's merely choice and it's merely fluid, well then, there's no way to claim that's who you are. So I think that's actually another, I think in a sense, a secondary derivative of Marxism that it is in our culture today. But keep going.
No, I mean, I agree. It's completely contradictory because at the end of the day, it's a roll of the dice. Basically, at the end of the day, you don't obey the creator, but you obey your instincts, right? Your instincts or whatever, your psychological makeup takes an absolute authority on you. The passions, right? I mean, if you remember in the classics like Plato and Aristotle, in some sense, idea required the domination of the passion. But now, because you can only dominate the passions in terms of some kind of transcendent good, truth, and beauty. Now, if you want to remove all references to anything transcending the person, your passions become completely normative, right? And so your passions, basically, you have to give in to them. An author that very clearly spelled this out was Herbert Marcuse in the 60s. The idea of the logos is oppressive. And ultimately, we have this idea that you have to be yourself. But being yourself, what does it mean? It means that you have to follow your instinct, your passion. So it's a complete inversion of the traditional relationship between reason and freedom, if you wish. And it is contradictory. Let me say, though, that, speaking of reason, this kind of reduction of reason to instrumentality, to productive tool, is not just Marxist, right? I mean, it was also, also in a sense the old positivist tradition. There was this idea that that there is only empiricism, but what makes Marx special is this connection between this reduction of reason and this idea of liberation, this idea of self-creation, and Del Noce thinks that also, by and large, scientism and positivism were elite phenomena, right? Like Auguste Comte, the French positivist of the 19th century, he viewed himself as the new pope of a new church of positivists, but nobody listened to him. Instead, unlike other secular movements of the 19th century, Marxism was able to reach the masses, the popular masses, was able to affect large numbers of people and to create mass political movements like communism, and then in a different version like the sexual revolution, which is not just Marxist, of course, because of that religious aspect, because of the appeal of this kind of religious impetus towards liberation, towards a new world, towards this kind of eschaton that you mentioned, made it at the same time potent, but also contradictory, so much so that it was transitional. It did a destructive work, but at the end of the day, it had to give in to the affluent society.
So that's the in a sense where the affluent society ends up, as we said earlier, and Del Noce says, this is where Marxism ultimately succeeds in this concepts of liberation.
The destructive part, yes.
The
part of denying that there is permanent moral values, for example, or denying that there is a truth that you have to respect even about yourself, right? That you're not the creator of your own truth. This is the part where Marxism really helped the march towards nihilism, if you want to use that word. While instead the other part of Marxism was this revolutionary impetus, this religious aspiration towards this new world proved illusory. And when the two split apart, in a sense, Marxism played into the hands of its enemies, the bourgeoisie.
Explain that a little bit.
Well, because Marx claimed that the revolution would kind of put an end to the bourgeois world and to create this new world of perfect equality. But on the other hand, his own metaphysics, his own philosophy, as we discussed before, proved, once the revolution is out of the picture, proved very compatible with a more radically bourgeois and materialistic worldview.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on. Then I think it's fascinating. I think it's one of the.
Let me give you an historical example because I like to talk abstractly. Sure. But think of the generation of 1968, right? The generation of 1968 had this dream of rebelling against the bourgeoisie. I mean, it was very common at that time to talk about criticizing the bourgeois world, for better or for worse.
Yep.
So in 1968, in Italy, in France, all these young people, they kind of went for the Marxist theory. And many of them were Catholics, for example. Like in Italy, a lot of the people who became Marxists in the late 60s had grown up in the Catholic culture. But then, once nothing happened, once the whole kind of Marxism theory that capitalism was on its last legs and was about to die and the revolution was coming never happened, all these people, by absorbing this kind of negative critique of the church, of education, of liberal arts, by absorbing all the Marxist critiques, they became yuppies. They became in the 80s. They become very bourgeois. They all become young professionals. They all become kind of turn their back on their religious traditions, whatever they were. And Marxism really kind of was a Trojan horse for secularization. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right. No, the yuppie example, I think, is right. It shows you essentially have, we talk about like cultural Catholics, or here you have cultural socialists, cultural Marxists living in a capitalist world. And the whole idea of yuppie, I think, is I think a good manifestation of that. I want to talk about a couple of other things that are key to some of Del Noce's ideas. One of them is totalitarianism. He writes a bit about totalitarianism. How does he define totalitarianism? What does he mean by it? And why is that also relevant to today?
Well, Del Noce really grew up under totalitarianism because he was born in 1910 and he came of age. Okay, when Mussolini came to power, he was 12. When Hitler came to power, he was 23. He saw that during the big Stalinist purges, he was 27, and then he lived through the Second World War. So his youth, up to the time he was 35, was really dominated by the experience of totalitarian violence. And you could argue that all of his philosophy is just an attempt to understand violence, and particularly the totalitarian form of violence. I mean, and again, everything is connected, because he says that what characterizes totalitarianism is to deny that we share in the same universal reason, right? It's the idea that if you are a Jew, you don't share in the same rationality as an Aryan. If you're a bourgeois, you don't share it. You just don't know what you're talking about. So you're not worth talking to. There is no conversation, because we don't share. There is communist rationality and bourgeois rationality. I mean, you can. Del Noce again saw that in the 1960s, when there was this big Freudian wave and the sexual revolution, in the idea of the repressed. You are repressed, so your arguments are not worthy of consideration because you are psychologically repressed. You are not sexually free or something like that. Or today there is the idea of the hater, right? The idea of the hater to Del Noce would be a totalitarian idea because, again, it denies that we have a shared common ground to talk about rationality. Right? If somebody is a hater, what can you do with the hater? You can just either kill the hater or brainwash him into something else, but there is no possibility of conversation, right? So to Del Noce, this is the root of totalitarianism. There is some kind of pseudoscience, like the Marxist pseudoscience of history or the certain version of psychoanalysis or the Nazi kind of racial sciences, which is used to separate people into groups. The one who are genuine, that follow the direction of history and embrace this pseudoscience, and the ones who are not up to it and must be essentially destroyed because there is no common ground for conversation. Does it make sense?
Yes, no, I think that's a way of thinking about it. I mean, there's a certain, there's a Vogelin writes about this. When asked questions, Marx would say, well, that's not a question for socialist man.
Precisely. And in fact, Del Noce quotes Vogelin saying that totalitarianism is the forbidding of the questions.
Right. I think in a sense, this is another theme of modernity that we have to struggle with. It's the ideological nature that of all politics that happens when truth is rejected. Mm-hmm. Because when you reject the philosophical project, that is the seeking after wisdom with, in a sense of reverence out before being, and you're trying to figure it out, as opposed to a totalitarianism, which is this is how the world works. I mean, I think the rejection of the possibility of truth ends up becoming totalitarian. I mean, I think this is why, and I've talked about this on this show before, where I think Ratzinger's point about the dictatorship of relativism right before he was elected pope. I mean, it's rhetorically brilliant, right? But it's something more profound than that because relativism can only become a dictatorship.
Right.
Because once there's no truth, now you have to have it determined by power in politics.
Yes, exactly. Another way to put it this way is that, atheism must lead to politicization, right? That in a sense, politics becomes everything because if our hope for salvation is in history and if our hope for salvation is to achieve this positive fulfillment of history, then anybody who disagrees with my politics is standing in the way of happiness. Or, I mean, there is no other possibility. So another way to define totalitarianism is the absolutization of politics. And Del Noce also describes this situation in which, in a society, politics invests everything because it becomes the ultimate horizon, the ultimate context for every activity, right? I mean, it could be the family, it could be religion, could be everything has to serve at the altar of this political liberation.
Do you think that is the remaining element in a sense of the revolutionary Gnostic spirit? So we have, in one sense, a hybrid of the affluent society and consumerism, but there's also this revolutionary spirit that we're still going to create heaven on earth. I mean, and you see it manifest, I think, in technology with like transhumanism, those kind of things, but you also see it in politics with like the idea that any dissent from my kind of politics is not just a disagreement, but that it is a block towards human happiness.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question. As I said before, in Marxism, there are these two aspects that to Del Noce are kind of paradigmatic, prototypical of modern secularism. And these two aspects are, on one hand, this revolutionary political positive impetus to bring the eschaton down to earth. And on the other side, there is the relativistic, technical, materialistic aspect that everything is relative and that ultimately, there is no common project. And now, these two things are contradictory, but it's not that one disappeared completely. The revolution did not completely disappear after, say, communism failed. But it kind of became more bourgeois. Like the sexual revolution, in my opinion, is a perfect example of a revolution that becomes individualistic, right? In the sense that it's no longer that we hope for the liberation of all in this social way, following some kind of intrinsic logic of history, but it's just that everybody can go from being repressed to being liberated. Right, so there is still a sense of revolution, but it's being bourgeoisified. Like it becomes individual. It's just about, again, my own happiness, but it's still there. So the impulse is there, but it's kind of decayed. It's like we have like the decayed revolution, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right, man. That was I gave the analogy of muscular revolution to a more of just an individualistic, pleasure-seeking revolution.
Well, one way you can put it, in Marx, the revolution corresponds to a certain theory of history, to a certain rationality. They talked about scientific socialism back in the day, right? And the idea of scientific socialism was that the revolution is not just arbitrary, but it reflects some knowledge of the mechanisms of history. Once that is gone, revolution becomes irrational in the sense. There is no more a science behind it, if you know what I mean. There is no more rationality behind it, and so it just becomes a projection of my will.
Mm-hmm. So let's we could talk about that more, but I want to ask another question on Del Noce, which is related to totalitarianism, and you brought it up already, which is his understanding of violence. He spends a lot of time writing about violence, what violence is, and the different kinds of violence. And I think here, and maybe, I don't know if you know the work of René Girard, but Girard, the French Catholic anthropologist, also writes about violence as a central element of understanding human life, but also of society and modern life. Del Noce talks about this a lot. Could you talk a little bit about his understanding of violence, and if possible, maybe if you have anything to say, how this intersects with René Girard's ideas?
I'm not sure about Girard, but I think his idea of violence is really kind of a corollary of what we said earlier, what you said about Gnosticism. Precisely because in a Gnostic vision, we have to make this transition, this like delivering a baby. That there's something completely new has to happen, in which the old world has to pass away and the new world has to come about. You see that violence is necessary. I mean, if violence is, you cannot criticize violence based on the ethics of a world which is dying, right? I mean, from a more Christian, also Greek traditional perspective, you can criticize violence in terms of eternal values, right? But if values are historical, the values of the old world are not the values of the new world. So the new world has every right, and the old world has no rights. So in this perspective, if the violence is what is going to, is the labor of delivery of the baby of the new world, the old world can make no claims against it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And it's also connected to that instrumentality, right? It's because there's no reason, you can't have a authentically reasoned critique of violence, because reason is in the service of the revolution, or reason doesn't have the justice and beauty and goodness and right and wrong are outside the realm of reason.
Yeah, another way to put that is my friend Michael Hamley likes to talk about transcendence. Del Noce says that Marx is the last expression of what he calls rationalism, that starting with Descartes, it denies that there is anything transcendent, right? So if there is nothing transcendent, as you just said, there is no reference point to criticize violence.
Mm-hmm. So violence, okay, so violence, so it's all interconnected. The totalitarianism, the violence, the rationality are all connected.
The same.
The other thing he talks about, and you talk about, is scientism. And he uses this language, you do, and I think it's interesting. I am worried about the problem of scientism as it applies in a lot of areas. So, for example, I directed a documentary film called Poverty, Inc., where we talk about just the poverty industry and how it works. And I don't mention this in the film, but I do in other places, that there's a certain kind of primacy of the technical, scientific reductionism, but it's almost like magical a little bit. And I think I give that poverty just as an example, because I think it's everywhere. It's not just in science, or anthropology, but it's even in policies. And this, there's in a sense, I think this is connected to empiricist rationality. But I hear this scientistic language around a lot. Now, in addition to being a Del Noce scholar, you're also a professor of physics and a mathematician. What's your take on both Del Noce's understanding of scientism, but also maybe some of the problems of scientism today? Maybe why don't you start by defining scientism in maybe your definition and or Del Noce's, both, maybe the same, and then maybe how does he look at it, and how do you see that as a problem today as part of secularization, maybe?
Yes, well, scientism, in my opinion, should be defined as the idea that science is the only true form of rationality. Now, this is obviously a contradictory statement because the phrase I just pronounced is not scientific. You know what I mean?
But that's the right. Well, that's the Regensburger critique, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's like you cannot improve empirically that empiricism is the only reasonable way of thinking. But it's
more than that, every human being in their experience is certain of many things that are not scientific. I mean, we are all certain that our mother loves us, or the day of our birthday is what our parents told us it was, or we all believe that Julius Caesar was assassinated in 1444 BC or whatever. It's just contradictory, but Del Noce says, interestingly, it is a decision of the will. It is a decision of the will of accepting as real only what can be empirically verified now by everybody through an experiment. Now, this is completely unrealistic, besides being contradictory, because even physicists cannot perform again all the experiments of physics. It's all based on trust. Physics and mathematics is based on trust that lots of stuff has been proved and demonstrated that we cannot reprove empirically ourselves. So the thing doesn't make sense. One thing I always like to say about scientists is that he doesn't understand that science is an abstract form of knowledge, which, you abstract certain aspects that you can measure, then you discern certain laws that you can then verify matching your measurements. But before all of that, you have to see the ball flying in the sky. There is a whole dimension of knowledge, of natural knowledge, which is not strictly scientific. It's a bundle of contradictions. But I think the reason it is popular is because, again, there is a decision against transcendence, because there is a decision that we don't want to ask questions, right? And so if you look at some of these, like Ayers, those, British positivists after World War II, it's really a decision not to ask questions. And if we decide that only what is empirical, I remember once I was talking to a friend of mine who was a good mathematician, and I told him about certain religious questions or whatever, and he told me, well, Carlo, I don't ask questions I cannot answer. Okay, so you see the nature of the position, that we decide a priori what can be controlled, what can be answered by certain methods, and we don't ask other questions. So, as you said, it is all related. When Del Noce writes of scientism, what I kind of realized after a while reading him is that he really has in mind very much the scientism of the sociologists and the psychologists of the 60s and 70s, right? Because especially in this country, I think after World War II, sociology and psychology took a big social role as alternative religions to some extent. You probably know more than I do, but there is a sense that, for example, the question of if you are unhappy with your marriage, you talk to a sexologist or you talk to a psychologist, right? There is an idea that basically there is a science of happiness, and so that human questions about meaning, about love, about the usual human questions, let's call them philosophical questions, have to be kind of censored or removed. What you need to do is to talk to an expert, and the expert will tell you how to improve your sex life or something like that. These are all the most common examples in which scientism operates in our culture.
I think you make a couple important, there's a lot we could go there, but I think a couple important points that you make is that this idea that scientism is a volitional opinion. It's an act of the will reject transcendence. I like the way that's articulated. I heard once a conversation. I think it was an atheist and a Catholic. They were debating, and the atheist said something to the effect, "Well, I don't believe in anything I can't empirically prove." Right, and so which was just humorous actually, because he was really affirming the importance of reason.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting question, or that science, I think. And I think the other thing that's related to that maybe you can comment, it's a bit off of Del Noce, but people like Michael Polanyi, who's written a lot on inarticulate rationality. This is something you said. There's so many things that we know that we don't know scientifically.
Right.
And then there's another, a very interesting 20th century German psychiatrist and physician named Carl Stern. Carl Stern wrote a couple of books, Flight from Woman, The Third Revolution, about religion and psychiatry.
Yes, I heard about it. I never read
he
the
actually
books.
has his Flight from Woman, the chapter on poetic knowledge is brilliant. It's really like, so what is scientific knowledge versus poetic knowledge? And what is this inarticulate rationality or connatural knowing? How do we know certain things? In a sense, you and I have never met, but we can have our first conversation and you could know something about me connaturally because we share the same nature.
Yes.
This whole idea of knowing through nature that St. Thomas and others write about. Anyway, this chapter by Stern is unbelievable. I mean, it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. In fact, I'm going to do a podcast on Carl Stern.
Can I make a comment on that?
Sure.
It's not that I think that the problem with the scientism is that it relies on experience. Is that it only accepts a reduced form of experience. Meaning that our experience of reality is much broader and objective than the abstract kind of empiricism that is part of the method of science. Science has its own method, which again, as I said, is abstract, but it doesn't exhaust experience. So, I think that there is an interesting passage in The Problem of Atheism, in which Del Noce says that the 20th century religious thought, some of the great theologians like Ratzinger and others, really there was a rediscovery of experience, but it is an experience which is complete, right? And that's right. So in a sense, what we want to do to respond to scientists is not to reject experience, but to point to the fullness of experience.
I think that, just like a quick comment, I think that's exactly right. So I give these lectures often on an outline of Christian anthropology. What does it mean what is a Christian understanding of the person? And before I go through like 7 characteristics, I always say, now it's important that we go back to our experience, our lived experience as persons. And I think that's I like how you articulate that that Del Noce's point is that, and Ratzinger, we're not reacting against the scientific method as somehow illegitimate. Of course, it's wonderful. It's just part of a broader understanding of human engagement with reality. And I think this maybe leads to a question for Del Noce, which is, he seems to say, and please correct me if I misunderstood him, that so he's a Catholic thinker and he's looking at, well, how do we deal with modernity? What are we doing? And that there seems to be a tension between, like, in a sense, a rejection of the past and a full, like, okay, we just have to accept modernity as it is, or a rejection of modernity and we go back into a type of kind of nostalgic traditionalism.
Okay.
And that he says, well, actually, we have to, in a sense, move through it. And I wonder if your point about this sense of that you made with Ratzinger, that we're not rejecting experience, we're actually expanding it. And that's the same thing Ratzinger says. We're not rejecting rationality, we're expanding rationality. Exactly. Maybe talk a little bit about Del Noce and his how do you engage with modernity, does he think?
Okay, first of all, Del Noce thinks that you have to distinguish modernity just as an historical time from modernity as a philosophical, mythological construct. Okay, because he thinks that there is a very strong idea of modernity, which has a ton of implications that have to be called into question. Like, for example, the idea of irreversibility, like the idea that modernity is this irreversible march towards secularization. The Noce points out that the integralists and the modernists share in this judgment. They both agree that there is this irreversible march towards secularization, except the modernists think it's great and the integralists think it's terrible. You see what I mean? So there is an inversion in the what he calls the axiological judgment, the evaluation of the problem, but there is still myth. There is still this myth that there is this new epoch which is marked by this necessary, deterministic, irreversible process. If that's modernity, he rejects this because it's a myth. I mean, it's not true. I mean, modernity is a complicated historical time in which there is atheism, there is secularization, there is also new forms of Christian experience, there is also great Christian thinkers. There is a great missionary expansion of the church, for example, outside of Europe. We should just look at things as they're in front of us, not reading them through this lens of the myth of modernity. That's his basic claim. Having said that, he does think that modernity is when post-Christian atheism came to the fore, right? That after the Middle Ages, for the first time, there was a new type of atheism that was not like anything that was there before Christianity. Because before Christianity, by and large, human beings saw themselves as part of the cosmos, right? And so the question of denying God was not really relevant because God, in some sense, coincided with the order of the universe, of the cosmos. On the contrary, after Christianity, there is a new type of atheism because to the extent that Christianity introduces a personal God, and it's a God that manifests itself in history, then there is a new possibility of negation that was not possible before Christianity. So he thinks that in modernity is where this new post-Christian atheism manifests itself for the first time, and in some sense we have to deal with it. But that's it.
I think this is, actually, it's kind of a brilliant point and a challenging one, because how often do we find ourselves buying into the myth of irreversible secularization? Exactly. And that becomes the framework or the starting point for how we view things. So in a sense, we create this reaction, but it's a reaction to a myth because it may very well be the case that, as you point out, we have new missionary activity. You have you could come to the point where, in a sense, the nihilism of bourgeois Marxism, of what do you call it, pure bourgeois, this kind of capitalist Marxist hybrid, just runs out of steam. It doesn't solve or serve the deep needs and wants of human beings. And there could be a move towards religious transcendence. And you even see, I mean, Ratzinger writes about this, some of this even in the hippie movement, right? So, I mean, I joke, I was born in 1969, so I always say, like, my goal is to take revenge on 1968. I don't really like that. Mm-hmm. But I think there's something there. There's a desire. In many ways, it gets co-opted. It gets taken over by this hybrid of materialism in its capitalist and revolutionary forms. It's sexual liberation, et cetera. But there is a sense like there's something not there that's not being solved mm-hmm. by this materialist world. And I think even with consumerism, I mean, I think clearly, I talk about those cultural critiques of capitalism. Capitalism does exacerbate consumerism, but consumerism is also a spiritual crying out.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think Pope Francis talks about that. It's the idea that everything can be consumed, and this could in fact fizzle out. I mean, in one sense, there's almost like comment on this a little bit. I'm thinking out loud here, but there's a certain kind of a Silicon Valley ethos that's not just there. I mean, it's in New York, it's all over. But this kind of sense like we're going to now move to the next step of the human being, right? We're going to artificial intelligence and this kind of strong AI, transhumanism, a real big move to genetic manipulation again and eugenics. And it's appealing to some people, but to a lot of people, they're like, I don't want that. I want deep, loving relationships. And in a sense, it could fade out. I mean, it may not. I mean, that's an optimistic reading. But the point, I think, with Del Noce, and correct me if you think it's wrong, is that, yes, it's the idea that it's irreversible, inexorable move towards secularization is actually a mythological postulate of modernity.
Exactly. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I mean, in fact, it's the only way in which this kind of nihilistic atheism can justify itself. It justifies itself based on inevitability, right? So if you have a culture that justifies itself based on its inevitability, you don't grant it to them. I mean, it's not a good move, even tactically. You know what I mean?
Right.
So Del Noce was very clear on that. Let me say another thing is that Del Noce says that one way to look at the divide is between those who recognize the religious dimension and those who deny it. I mean, which means those who recognize that human beings have these deep desires for happiness, for truth, for justice, for beauty, that ultimately will always be there. That is, it cannot be eliminated. It cannot be taken away. So the religious questions will always be there. You can have as much technical progress as you want, as much affluence as you want. You can have the singularity. People will still be needing more. They will still have religious questions. And then there is those who deny these religious questions, right? And so, again, in a sense, modernity has failed to remove these religious questions. People still have them. They will always have them, right? And so one cannot but keep asking the questions. So that's the best answer, in a sense, to this kind of reductive modernity, to keep asking the questions that we have.
You know, two things that come out. I think one is the importance that the religious nature of man doesn't go away. And sometimes I talk about global secularism. It's a little bit related, that religion doesn't go away. And I think what we're seeing now, which is also in a sense a repeat of some of the religious nature of Marxism, is we're seeing a re-mythologization of politics. Mm-hmm. We're seeing a re-sacralization of the state in a new form in contemporary globalism, which so that there's, I think, a religious dimension. But I think also here's a question for you, and I'm not sure how to articulate it, so I'll try, and maybe you can help me. So you mentioned this religious nature. There's a desire for a human being for something transcendent, for goodness. You know, for these are the transcendentals of the
also
medieval
for
thinkers, right?
Meaning. Another word you can say is meaning.
Yeah, meaning and beauty,
right.
and that. Yeah, but I think maybe we can summarize truth, goodness, beauty. We can start in meaning. There's a desire for meaning besides the technical. So I listen to different people on podcasts or hear people talking, and I hear sometimes people who identify as progressive and secular, very scientific. And it's almost like you can hear in their work this frustration, this crying out for meaning. There's a sense, like I'll hear people say, like, why does no one think that? And I think, well, I know hundreds of people who think that. Mm-hmm. They just mostly are called, a lot of them are Orthodox Catholics, Orthodox Jews, Orthodox Protestants. They think that. You just maybe don't meet them.
Right.
Right. That's one thing. But but more precisely, like I'll hear people who are, deeply grounded in the sciences, and they're trying to find this way out. They're frustrated. But the idea that, say, what I'll just call broadly Orthodox religion, right? Traditional Orthodox religion, Catholicism, Judaism, okay, Orthodoxy, whatever. That's not an option to them. It's like their scientific training prevents that from being a viable live option.
Right.
Why do you think that's the case?
That's a form of dogmatism, but which is kind of instilled by the educational system, I suppose. The thing though to keep in mind is really that Del Noce says where our current culture attacks religion is not on faith, but not on the answers, but on the questions, right? If you think of the great traditional faith as answers to the religious questions that people have, the way our culture tends to attack is not by attacking the answers, but by denying the questions, by teaching people that you can be happy without asking these questions, that technology will solve all the problems, or that politics will solve all the problems, and so there is no point in asking the religious questions. And then if questions are not asked, the answers are not interesting. And so I think that really our task is to, before anything else, to reawaken the questions.
It's very good. It's very good. And well, thanks, Carlo. This has been fantastic. I really enjoyed our conversation. I've learned a lot. Thanks for taking time to join the podcast, and I hope I can ask you to come back sometime.
Sure. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you.